Welcome to The Explainer. Atheism. It's one of those words, right? They can spark some really intense debate, but what does it actually mean? Well, today, we're going to cut through all that noise and demystify this whole concept.
All right, so let's just jump right in. What is atheism, really? It seems like a pretty simple question, but trust me, the answer is surprisingly complex, and it's surrounded by a ton of misconceptions.
Okay, so here's the game plan for this explainer. We're going to start with the basics, the definition. Then we'll look at all the different forms it takes, check out the core arguments, see where it fits in around the world, and wrap things up with some of those deeper philosophical questions. Okay, let's dive right into section 1. To really get a handle on atheism, we've got to get one critical distinction straight right from the get-go, and that's the difference between what someone believes and what they claim to know. Okay, check this out. Atheism is all about belief, or more accurately, a lack of belief. Agnosticism, on the other hand, is about knowledge. It's about what we can or can't know for sure. This is so important because it means they aren't mutually exclusive. You can totally be an agnostic atheist. That just means you lack a belief in God, while also admitting you can't know for certain if one exists.
And if you look at the word itself, it makes perfect sense. Atheism comes straight from the Greek. A means without, and theos means God. So literally, at its most basic level, it just means without a God. Simple as that.
All right, so let's move into our next section. Because here's the thing. Atheism isn't just one single rigid idea. It's not a monolith. It's actually a pretty broad spectrum that covers a whole range of different positions. See, atheism really isn't a one-size-fits-all kind of thing. You can actually map it out by asking two simple questions. First, is someone even aware of the whole concept of God? And second, do they just lack a belief, or do they actively believe God does not exist? This chart breaks it all down.
So that first distinction we talked about is between implicit and explicit atheism. Implicit atheism, well, that's just the state of not having a belief in a God simply because the idea has never even crossed your mind. You've never been introduced to it.
And the philosopher Baron de Holbach absolutely nailed this idea way back in 1772. He basically said that all children are born atheists because, well, they have no idea what a God even is. It perfectly illustrates the concept.
Okay, so the other big distinction you'll hear about is between weak and strong atheism. Weak atheism, sometimes called negative atheism, is just that simple lack of belief in God. But strong, or positive atheism, that takes it a step further. It's the active claim, the actual belief that no gods exist.
All right, so now that we've kind of defined our terms, what are the actual philosophical arguments that lead someone to explicit atheism? Well, they generally follow two main paths of reasoning.
You can think of it like this. One path argues against an impossible God, and the other argues against an improbable God. So the first one uses pure logic to say the very concept of God doesn't make sense, while the second looks at the world around us as evidence that God's existence is just really, really unlikely.
Okay, so these deductive arguments, they're all about digging into logical contradictions. They ask if the whole idea of God can even hold up to scrutiny. Take the famous stone paradox, for example. It's a real brain twister. It asks, can an all-powerful being create a stone so heavy that even they can't lift it? See the problem? If they can, they're not all-powerful. If they can't, they're also not all-powerful. It's a logical trap.
Now, inductive arguments are totally different. They're based on evidence from the world we see. They look at things like the immense suffering that exists, or the fact that a supposedly loving God seems to be hidden from so many people who are genuinely searching for belief. And from that evidence, they conclude that the existence of such a God is pretty improbable.
And this parable from the philosopher J.L. Schellenberg is so powerful because it really gets to the emotional core of that argument from non-belief. I mean, just think about it. It asks us to consider, if a loving God really exists and could easily make their presence known, then why do so many sincere prayers and calls for connection seem to go completely unanswered?
Okay, so we've looked at the philosophy behind it. Now let's zoom out a bit. Let's ground this in reality and take a look at the history and how atheism shows up around the world today.
It's interesting. While people openly calling themselves atheists is a pretty modern thing, it really took off during the Enlightenment. The actual ideas questioning the gods, they go way, way back. We're talking ancient Greece, 5th century BC, when the philosopher Anaxagoras got himself banished from Athens just for suggesting the sun was a hot rock and not a god.
So fast forward to today. Globally, about 2.3% of people explicitly say, I'm an atheist. But, and this is a big but,
that number doesn't really tell the whole story. There's a much larger group, almost 12%, who identify as non-religious. They might not actively disbelieve, but they aren't part of any specific religion either.
But even that global average can be misleading, because it hides some really dramatic regional differences. And these are often tied to history and culture. I mean, look at this. You have places like Sweden, where non-belief is as high as 85%. But then in a place like Italy, it's way down around 6%. That just goes to show you how different societal paths can be.
And all of this brings us to our final section, where we get to the real core of the whole debate, that fundamental tension between evidence, faith, and reason.
So the philosopher Antony Flew came up with this really key idea he called the presumption of atheism. Think of it like a courtroom. A defendant is presumed innocent until proven guilty, right? Flew argued it should be the same with belief. The default position should be non-belief, and the burden of proof, well, that falls on the person making the positive claim, in this case, the person who says a God exists.
And this idea kind of leads us to a more modern concept called friendly atheism. It's a really interesting perspective. It basically says that someone's belief can be totally justified based on the information and reasoning that's available to them. So what does that mean? It means an atheist can think a theist's belief is factually wrong, but still accept that the theist got to that belief in a rational, thoughtful way.
And that, really, leaves us with one final big question to chew on. When you lay out all the arguments, when you look at all the evidence, is belief ultimately a matter of proof? Or is it rooted in something else entirely? What do you think is the true foundation of belief itself?